The candle burned low as Edmund Ashworth, Duke of Pelhurst, knelt beside a narrow army cot inside a tent that smelled of smoke and blood. His closest friend, Captain James Alden, lay pale and still, his breathing shallow and broken. Outside, the sound of distant cannon fire had finally stopped, but inside the tent, a different kind of battle was being fought. "Edmund," James whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "Edmund, listen to me. There is not much time." Edmund gripped his friend's hand tightly. "Do not speak like that. The surgeon will come. You will live, James. You must live." James gave a weak, tired smile. He had always been the calmer of the two, even in the middle of danger. "We both know that is not true. Please, do not waste the little time we have arguing with me." Edmund's throat tightened. He had known James since they were boys running through the fields near Pelhurst Hall, long before either of them understood titles, duty, or war. James had been more than a friend. He had been like a brother, steady and honest, the kind of man who never asked for anything and gave everything. "Then tell me," Edmund said quietly. "Tell me what you need." James turned his head slightly, his eyes searching Edmund's face as though memorizing it. "My sister, Charlotte." Edmund's chest tightened at the name. He had heard of Charlotte Alden many times through James's letters, though he had never met her. James had always spoken of her with such warmth, describing her as clever, gentle, and far too kind for the cruel world she lived in. "What of her?" Edmund asked. "When I am gone, she will have no one," James said, his words slow and heavy with effort. "Our father is dead. Our estate will pass to our cousin, Mr. Harold Finch, a man with no love in his heart, and no patience for a woman who is not useful to him. Charlotte has no fortune of her own, no protection. I fear what will become of her." Edmund felt the weight of his friend's fear settle over him like a stone. "James, Promise me," James interrupted, his grip suddenly firm despite his weakness. "Promise me, you will look after her. Protect her. Make certain she is safe, whatever it costs you. Please, Edmund. I cannot leave this world in peace unless I know she will be cared for." Edmund looked into his friend's eyes that had once been full of laughter and mischief, now dimmed by pain and fading life. He thought of all the years of friendship, the battles fought side by side, the letters shared, the quiet nights spent talking about the future. He thought of everything James had given him, without ever asking for anything in return. "I promise," Edmund said, his voice steady despite the ache building in his chest. "I swear to you, James, I will protect her. I will make certain no harm comes to her, not while I live." A look of peace settled over James's face, as though a great burden had finally been lifted from him. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you, my friend." Those were the last words James Alden ever spoke. Within the hour, he was gone, and Edmund Ashworth was left alone with a promise that would change the course of his life forever. The journey back to England felt endless. Edmund spent long days at sea, staring out at the gray water, replaying his friend's final moments over and over in his mind. He had faced danger many times as a soldier, had seen men fall beside him, but nothing had prepared him for the silence James left behind. It was not only grief that weighed on him, but the heavy responsibility of a promise made at a deathbed, a promise he intended to honor no matter what it required of him. When he finally arrived at Pelhurst Hall, his family home in the English countryside, Edmund found little comfort in its familiar halls. The Duke, who had once been a light-hearted young man, had returned as someone quieter, more serious, carrying grief like armor beneath his fine coat. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, noticed the change immediately, but said nothing at first, sensing that her son needed time before he could speak of what had happened. It took Edmund several weeks to gather the courage to inquire about Charlotte Alden's situation. When he finally sent a letter to the Alden estate, the reply that came back troubled him deeply. Charlotte's cousin, Mr. Harold Finch, had indeed inherited the family estate, exactly as James had feared. But the news went further than that. Word had reached Edmund, through a mutual acquaintance who knew the Alden family well, that Finch was already arranging a marriage for Charlotte, one meant to settle his own debts rather than secure her happiness. The intended husband was a man known throughout society for his poor reputation and careless treatment of those beneath him in fortune. Edmund sat alone in his study for a long while after reading the letter, staring at the fire as it crackled and popped in the hearth. He thought of James's face in that tent, the desperation in his eyes as he begged Edmund to keep his sister safe. He thought of the promise he had made, a promise that suddenly felt far heavier than he had first understood. He could write to Finch, perhaps. He could offer money, or use his influence as a duke to intervene on Charlotte's behalf. But he knew, even as he considered these options, that they would not be enough. Finch was a proud man who resented anyone questioning his authority over the estate he had inherited. He would not easily give up his plans, especially not for the sake of a woman's comfort. There was only one way, Edmund realized slowly, to truly protect Charlotte Alden from a fate she did not deserve. He would need to remove her from Finch's control entirely, and the only respectable way to do that, without causing scandal or ruining her reputation, was through marriage. The thought startled him at first. He had never met the woman. He knew her only through the fond descriptions in James's letters, descriptions written by a brother who loved his sister deeply and saw the best in her. Marrying a stranger, simply to fulfill a promise, was not something Edmund had ever imagined for himself. He had always assumed that if he married, it would be for reasons of family alliance, or perhaps, in some quiet corner of his heart, for genuine affection. But as he sat there in the firelight, turning the matter over again and again, he understood there was no other path forward. This was what James had asked of him. This was what honor demanded, and if a marriage of duty was what it took to keep his promise, then Edmund would not hesitate. He wrote to Charlotte directly the very next morning, a formal letter introducing himself as James's closest friend and explaining, as gently as he could, the circumstances that had brought him to write. He did not mention marriage in that first letter. He wished to see her reaction, to understand her situation better, before making such a significant proposal. He also wrote to Mr. Finch, requesting permission to call upon the family, presenting himself simply as a friend of the late Captain Alden, who wished to pay his respects. The reply from Finch came quickly, filled with false warmth and clear self-interest. He welcomed the Duke of Pelhurst to visit, no doubt sensing an opportunity to gain favor with a man of such high rank and fortune. Charlotte's own reply, however, was brief and careful, thanking Edmund for his kindness, but revealing little of her true feelings. Edmund could sense, even through the short and formal lines, a woman who had learned to guard herself carefully against disappointment. When Edmund finally arrived at the Alden estate several days later, he was struck immediately by the quiet sadness that seemed to hang over the house. It was smaller and less grand than Pelhurst Hall, but it had clearly once been a happy home. Now, portraits hung crookedly on the walls, and the gardens outside showed signs of neglect, as though no one had the heart to care for them anymore. Charlotte Alden received him in a small drawing room, dressed in dark mourning clothes that seemed to swallow her slender frame. She was younger than Edmund had expected, with dark hair pulled back simply, and eyes that held a quiet sorrow he recognized all too well, for he had seen the same sorrow reflected in his own mirror since returning from war. "Your Grace," she said, offering a polite curtsy, "it is kind of you to come. James wrote of you often. He considered you a true friend." "As I considered him," Edmund replied, bowing slightly. "I am deeply sorry for your loss, Miss Alden. Your brother was the finest man I ever had the honor to know." A flicker of emotion crossed Charlotte's face before she carefully composed herself again. "Thank you," she said softly. "Please, sit. May I offer you tea?" As they spoke, carefully at first, and then with growing ease, Edmund began to see glimpses of the woman James had described in his letters. She was thoughtful and intelligent, asking sensible questions about the war and listening carefully to his answers. She spoke of her brother with such tender affection that Edmund found himself deeply moved, remembering their own friendship with fresh sorrow. But beneath her composed manner, Edmund also noticed something else. A tightness around her eyes whenever her cousin's name was mentioned. A careful way of choosing her words, as though she feared being overheard or misunderstood. When Finch entered the room briefly to greet their guest, Edmund watched closely as Charlotte's posture stiffened, her hands folding tightly in her lap. It confirmed everything Edmund had feared. Charlotte Alden was not safe in this house. She was not free, and unless something changed, she would soon be forced into a marriage that would bring her nothing but unhappiness. That night, as Edmund rode back toward the inn, where he had taken lodging, he made his decision. He would return the following day, and he would speak with Charlotte directly, honestly, about what he intended to propose. He did not know how she would respond. He did not know if she would accept a marriage built not on love, but on duty and protection. But he knew, without question, that he could not leave her to the fate Finch had planned for her. As he lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling of his rented room, Edmund thought once more of James's final words. He had promised to protect her, whatever it cost him. He had not imagined, when he made that vow, that it might cost him his own freedom, his own future. But looking back on the quiet strength he had seen in Charlotte's eyes that afternoon, Edmund found that the cost did not trouble him as much as he might have expected. Tomorrow, he would ask Charlotte Alden to become his wife, and whatever came after, he would keep his promise to his friend, no matter what sacrifices it required of him. Morning light spilled through the windows of the Alden estate as Edmund Ashworth walked once more toward the drawing room, his heart beating with a steadiness he did not entirely feel. He had rehearsed his words carefully during the ride from the inn, yet now that the moment had arrived, every sentence he had prepared seemed suddenly inadequate. Charlotte was waiting for him, seated near the window with a book resting unopened in her lap. She rose when he entered, offering a polite greeting, though Edmund noticed the faint shadows beneath her eyes, as though sleep had not come easily to her either. "Your Grace," she said, "I did not expect you to return so soon." "Miss Alden," Edmund replied, bowing, "forgive my early visit. There is a matter I wish to discuss with you, one of some importance. I hope you will grant me a few moments of your time." Charlotte gestured toward the chair across from her, and Edmund seated himself, choosing his words with great care. "I will speak plainly," he began, "for I believe you deserve honesty above all else. Since my return from war, I have learned of your situation here. I know of your cousin's plans regarding your marriage, and I know enough of the man in question to understand that such a match would bring you little happiness, and perhaps considerable hardship." Charlotte's expression grew guarded, her hands tightening slightly around the edges of her book. "Your Grace, I appreciate your concern, but such matters are not easily changed. My cousin holds authority over the estate, and therefore, over my future as well." "That is precisely why I have come," Edmund said. "I made a promise to your brother before he died, a promise to see that you were protected and cared for. I do not take such a vow lightly, and after much thought, I believe there is only one way I can truly honor it." He paused, watching her carefully before continuing. "I am asking you to consider marrying me, Miss Alden." For a long moment, Charlotte said nothing at all. Her eyes widened slightly, and Edmund could see the surprise, and perhaps a flicker of something closer to alarm, cross her features. "Marry you," she repeated slowly. "Your Grace, we barely know one another. You have visited me only twice." "I understand this is sudden," Edmund replied, "and I will not pretend that this proposal comes from affection built over years of acquaintance, for that would be dishonest. But I can offer you something equally important: protection, freedom from your cousin's control, a home where you will never again be forced into a marriage not of your choosing. I ask only that you consider it, not as a romantic gesture, but as a practical solution to a difficult situation." Charlotte rose from her seat and walked slowly toward the window, staring out at the neglected gardens below. Edmund watched her in silence, giving her the space to think, though his own heart pounded with uncertainty. "You would truly do this," she said finally, without turning around, "simply because of a promise made to my brother?" "James was the finest friend I ever had," Edmund said quietly. "He gave me his loyalty, his honesty, and in the end, his final wish. I cannot repay him now, except through you. If accepting my proposal would bring you further pain, then I will withdraw it at once and find another way to help you. But I could not, in good conscience, leave without offering you this choice." Charlotte turned back to face him, her eyes searching his face, as though trying to determine the truth behind his words. "And what would you expect of me, as your wife? A duchess is expected to fulfill certain duties, to host, to manage a household, to eventually provide an heir. I would expect nothing you were not willing to give," Edmund answered honestly. "I do not wish to trap you in a marriage that brings you misery. If, in time, you wished for nothing more than a peaceful, respectful arrangement between us, I would honor that wish completely." Charlotte was quiet again for a long moment, her gaze drifting back toward the window. Edmund could see the difficulty of the decision weighing on her, the fear of trading one uncertain future for another. He did not press her further, understanding that such a choice could not be rushed. "May I have until tomorrow to consider your offer?" she asked finally. "Of course," Edmund replied. Take whatever time you require. That evening, Edmund returned to his lodgings with a heavy heart, uncertain whether Charlotte would accept his proposal or reject it entirely. He understood her hesitation. He was, after all, a stranger to her, someone whose only connection to her was through grief and loss. He wondered, not for the first time, whether he was doing the right thing, or whether his own guilt over surviving the war, while James had not, was clouding his judgment. Yet even as doubt crept into his thoughts, Edmund could not deny the sense of purpose that had settled over him since making the promise to James. For the first time since returning from battle, he felt as though he had something meaningful to focus on, something beyond the empty routines of managing his estate and attending obligatory social gatherings. The following morning, Edmund received word that Charlotte wished to see him once more. His heart quickened as he made his way back to the Alden estate, uncertain of what answer awaited him. This time, Charlotte received him alone in the drawing room, her posture composed, but her eyes revealing a quiet determination Edmund had not seen in their previous meetings. "Your Grace," she began, "I have thought carefully about your proposal. I understand that this marriage would not be born from affection, but from duty and circumstance. I am willing to accept it on certain conditions." Edmund felt a wave of relief wash over him, though he kept his expression composed. "Name your conditions, Miss Alden, and I will do everything in my power to honor them." "First," Charlotte said, "I ask that I be permitted to continue supporting the tenants and servants who once worked for my family, should any of them require assistance in the future. My brother cared deeply for them, and I would not wish to abandon that responsibility." "Granted," Edmund said without hesitation. "Second," she continued, "I ask for honesty between us, always. If either of us grows unhappy with the arrangement, I would rather know the truth than live under false pretenses." "You have my word," Edmund replied. "And finally," Charlotte said, her voice growing quieter, "I ask that you allow me time to grieve my brother in my own way, without expectation that I will quickly become the composed, dutiful wife society expects of a duchess. My grief is still very raw, Your Grace, and I cannot pretend otherwise." Edmund's chest tightened at her words, understanding all too well the weight of grief she carried, for he carried a similar burden himself. "You need no such pretense with me," he said gently. "I grieve him as well, Miss Alden. Perhaps in time, we may find some comfort in remembering him together." A faint, sad smile touched Charlotte's lips at his words, the first genuine expression of warmth Edmund had seen from her since their acquaintance began. "Then I accept your proposal, Your Grace. I will marry you." Arrangements moved quickly after Charlotte's acceptance. Mr. Finch, upon learning that his cousin would instead marry a duke rather than the man he had originally intended, offered little resistance. If anything, he seemed pleased by the connection such a marriage would bring to his own social standing, and he made no attempt to interfere with the sudden change in plans. The wedding itself was a quiet affair, held in a small chapel near the Alden estate, with only a handful of witnesses present. Charlotte wore a simple gray gown, still within the bounds of proper mourning attire, and Edmund stood beside her in his formal duke's attire, feeling the strange weight of the moment settle over him. As the vicar spoke the traditional vows, Edmund found himself watching Charlotte's face carefully, searching for any sign of regret or fear. She remained composed throughout the ceremony, her voice steady as she repeated her vows, though Edmund noticed the slight trembling of her hands as they exchanged rings. When the ceremony concluded, and they were pronounced husband and wife, there was no celebration, no grand feast or joyous gathering of family and friends. Instead, Edmund and Charlotte returned quietly to Pelhurst Hall, two strangers bound together by grief, duty, and a promise made to a dying man on a distant battlefield. As their carriage rolled up the long drive toward Pelhurst Hall, Charlotte gazed out the window at her new home, her expression unreadable. Edmund watched her silently, wondering what thoughts occupied her mind, wondering if she felt any of the same uncertainty that weighed on his own heart. "It is a fine house," Charlotte said softly, breaking the silence between them. "I hope you will come to think of it as your home," Edmund replied. "In time." Charlotte turned to look at him then, her dark eyes meeting his with a quiet, searching intensity. "Time," she repeated softly, almost to herself. "Yes, perhaps time will help us both." Neither of them spoke further, as the carriage came to a stop before the grand entrance of Pelhurst Hall. As footmen hurried forward to assist them, Edmund offered his hand to help Charlotte down from the carriage. She hesitated only a moment before accepting it, her fingers light and cool against his palm. Standing together before the entrance of the home that would now belong to them both, Edmund felt the full weight of what he had promised settle over him once more. He had married a woman he barely knew, bound not by love, but by honor and duty to a friend, now lost to him forever. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever difficulties their unusual arrangement might bring, Edmund resolved once again to honor the promise he had made. He glanced at Charlotte, standing quietly beside him, her eyes fixed on the grand doors before them, and wondered, not for the first time, what the future truly held for the two of them now bound together as husband and wife. The first weeks at Pelhurst Hall passed slowly, marked by a careful politeness that neither Edmund nor Charlotte seemed able to move beyond. They took their meals together, spoke of ordinary matters such as the weather or the state of the roads, and retired each evening to separate chambers with a formal good night that revealed nothing of what either of them truly felt. Charlotte spent much of her time exploring the vast house that was now hers to manage, though she moved through its halls with the quiet caution of a guest rather than a mistress. The staff treated her with respect, but Charlotte could sense their uncertainty as well, unsure of how to regard a new duchess who had arrived under such unusual circumstances. Word had already spread, as it always did among servants, that the marriage had been arranged out of duty rather than affection, and though no one spoke of it openly in her presence, Charlotte often caught curious glances following her through the corridors. Edmund, for his part, retreated into the familiar routines that had defined his life since returning from war. He spent long hours in his study, reviewing estate matters and correspondence, emerging only for meals or when duty required his presence elsewhere. It was not that he wished to avoid Charlotte, exactly, but rather that he did not know how to bridge the distance between them, uncertain of what role he was meant to play in her life beyond that of protector. One afternoon, several weeks into their marriage, Charlotte discovered a small collection of letters tucked away in a drawer of the library desk. She recognized the handwriting immediately, her breath catching as she realized they were letters from James, written to Edmund during their years of friendship before the war had separated them from ordinary life. She sat down slowly, the letters trembling slightly in her hands, and began to read. The letters revealed a side of her brother she had known well, his humor, his warmth, his deep loyalty to those he cared for. But they also revealed his friendship with Edmund in vivid detail, stories of their boyhood adventures, their shared dreams for the future, the easy companionship that had clearly meant so much to both young men. Charlotte found herself smiling and weeping in equal measure as she read, grateful for this unexpected glimpse into her brother's happier days. She did not hear Edmund enter the library until he cleared his throat softly from the doorway. Startled, Charlotte quickly wiped at her eyes and rose to her feet, still clutching the letters. "Forgive me," she said quickly. "I did not mean to intrude upon your private correspondence. I found these in the desk and could not help myself." Edmund's expression softened as he recognized the letters in her hands. "There is nothing to forgive," he said gently, crossing the room to stand beside her. "James wrote those letters freely, and I have always treasured them. You are welcome to read them, Charlotte, whenever you wish." It was the first time he had called her simply by her given name, without the formal Miss Alden or Your Grace that had marked their interactions thus far. Charlotte noticed the change immediately, and something in her chest loosened slightly at the warmth in his voice. "He speaks of you so often," she said softly, looking down at the letters once more. "And so fondly. I had not realized how close you truly were." "He was the best friend I ever had," Edmund replied, his voice thick with emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. "I think of him every day. I imagine you do as well." Charlotte nodded, unable to speak for a moment, as fresh grief rose within her. Edmund, seeing her distress, hesitated only briefly, before reaching out and gently taking her hand in his. "We do not have to pretend, you and I," he said quietly, "not with each other. If you wish to speak of him, or to weep for him, you need not hide such feelings from me. I understand them better than most." Charlotte looked up at him then, surprised by the depth of understanding in his eyes. For the first time since their wedding, she felt as though she were truly seeing him, not the composed and dutiful duke who had proposed marriage out of obligation, but a man who carried his own grief, his own wounds from the war, hidden beneath a careful exterior. "Thank you," she whispered, I did not expect such kindness." "You deserve far more than kindness, Charlotte," Edmund replied. "You deserve happiness, whatever form that may take." From that moment forward, something shifted subtly between them. Their conversations grew longer and more comfortable, no longer confined to polite discussions of weather or household matters. Charlotte began joining Edmund in the library some evenings, where they would read quietly together, occasionally sharing passages aloud or discussing books they had both enjoyed. Edmund found himself looking forward to these quiet moments more than he cared to admit, drawn to Charlotte's thoughtful observations and the gentle humor that occasionally slipped through her careful composure. Charlotte, in turn, began taking a more active role in managing the household, much to the relief of the staff who had grown accustomed to a certain neglect during Edmund's long months of solitary grief following his return from war. She reorganized the household accounts, addressed several matters that had been overlooked, and slowly began to bring a sense of warmth back to the great house that had felt cold and empty for far too long. One evening, as autumn settled over the countryside surrounding Pelhurst Hall, Charlotte discovered Edmund standing quietly in the portrait gallery, staring up at a painting she had not noticed before. She approached slowly, curious, and realized the portrait depicted a much younger Edmund standing alongside James, both of them dressed in their military uniforms, smiling broadly with the careless confidence of young men who had not yet faced the horrors of war. "I did not know this portrait existed," Charlotte said softly, coming to stand beside him. Edmund glanced at her, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. "It was painted shortly before we were sent abroad. James insisted upon it, said he wanted something to remember our friendship by, in case either of us did not return." He paused, his gaze returning to the painting. "I come here sometimes, in the evenings, simply to remember him, as he was then, before everything changed." Charlotte studied the painting carefully, taking in the youthful joy captured in both young men's expressions. "He looks so happy here," she said quietly. "I had almost forgotten what he looked like before the war changed him." "He never lost that joy entirely," Edmund said. "Even at the end, even wounded and in pain, he found moments of peace. He spoke of you often in his final days, you know. He worried for you constantly." "I know," Charlotte whispered. "He always did worry too much." They stood together in comfortable silence for a long moment, both lost in memories of the man who had brought them together, however unconventional the circumstances. Edmund found himself acutely aware of Charlotte's presence beside him, the faint scent of lavender that seemed to follow her, the quiet strength she carried despite her grief. "Charlotte," he said finally, breaking the silence, "I want you to know that whatever this marriage began as, I do not regret it. I know our circumstances were unusual, and I know I asked much of you in accepting my proposal, but I am grateful, truly, for your presence here." Charlotte turned to look at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "I feel the same, Edmund," she admitted softly. "I did not expect to find any comfort in this arrangement, yet I have. You have been kinder to me than I ever anticipated." Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of the growing bond neither of them had expected to form. Edmund felt his heart quicken slightly, though he quickly reminded himself of the careful boundaries they had established, boundaries built on duty rather than romantic affection. He cleared his throat softly and stepped back, breaking the moment before it could grow into something neither of them was prepared to acknowledge. "It grows late," he said. "You should rest, Charlotte." "Yes," she agreed, though a flicker of something like disappointment crossed her features before she carefully composed herself once more. "Good night, Edmund." As Charlotte made her way toward her chambers, Edmund remained in the portrait gallery a while longer, staring up at the painting of his younger self and his lost friend. He thought of James's final words, the desperate plea to protect Charlotte, to keep her safe. He had fulfilled that promise, he told himself. He had given her protection, a respectable home, freedom from her cousin's control. Yet standing there in the quiet gallery, Edmund found himself wondering if duty alone could explain the warmth that had begun to grow within him whenever Charlotte was near. He pushed the thought aside quickly, reminding himself that such feelings were inappropriate, unwelcome complications to an arrangement built on honor rather than affection. Charlotte deserved better than a husband confused about his own feelings, better than a marriage clouded by uncertainty. Still, as he finally made his way toward his own chambers that night, Edmund could not entirely dismiss the growing awareness that his feelings toward Charlotte had begun to shift into something far more complicated than simple duty. In the weeks that followed, Edmund's mother, the Dowager Duchess, arrived at Pelhurst Hall for an extended visit, eager to meet the new Duchess whose sudden marriage to her son had caused considerable gossip among their social circle. The Dowager Duchess was a formidable woman, known throughout society for her sharp tongue and exacting standards, and Charlotte found herself immediately intimidated by her presence. "So," the Dowager Duchess said during their first meeting, studying Charlotte with a critical eye, "you are the young woman my son married so suddenly, out of obligation to a fallen friend. Tell me, do you love him?" Charlotte, caught off guard by the blunt question, hesitated before answering carefully. We are still becoming acquainted with one another, Your Grace. Our marriage was born of unusual circumstances, but I have great respect for your son." "Respect," the Dowager Duchess repeated, her tone unreadable. "That is a beginning, I suppose. Edmund has always been a serious young man, too serious for his own good, if you ask my opinion. Perhaps you will bring some warmth back into this house. It has felt cold enough since he returned from that dreadful war." Despite her sharp manner, Charlotte sensed genuine concern for Edmund beneath the Dowager Duchess's critical words, and over the following days, she found herself growing to understand the older woman better. The Dowager Duchess had lost her own husband years earlier, and had watched her son go off to war, uncertain if he would ever return. Her sharpness, Charlotte realized, was born from her own fears and losses, much like the careful composure Charlotte herself maintained to protect her grieving heart. One evening, as the three of them dined together, the Dowager Duchess observed the quiet exchanges between Edmund and Charlotte, with evident interest. She noticed the way Edmund's expression softened whenever Charlotte spoke, the way Charlotte's careful composure seemed to ease slightly in his presence. Though neither of them acknowledged it openly, something had clearly begun to grow between the two of them, something far beyond the simple duty that had originally bound them together. "You know," the Dowager Duchess said later that evening, catching Edmund alone in the study, "your friend James would be pleased to see how well you have cared for his sister. But I wonder, Edmund, if duty alone explains the way you look at her now." Edmund glanced up sharply from his papers, startled by his mother's perceptiveness. "I do not know what you mean," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. The Dowager Duchess simply smiled knowingly and left the room without further comment, leaving Edmund alone, with thoughts he was not yet ready to fully confront. He stared at the fire for a long while that night, unable to deny any longer that his feelings toward Charlotte had grown into something far more complicated and far more meaningful than mere obligation to a fallen friend. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing the grounds of Pelhurst Hall in a thick layer of frost that turned the gardens silver each morning. Charlotte had grown accustomed to her new life, though she still found herself surprised, at times, by how much had changed since her arrival. The household ran smoothly now under her careful management. The staff had warmed considerably to their new mistress, and the quiet distance that had once defined her relationship with Edmund had slowly transformed into something far more comfortable. They had settled into a routine of shared evenings, reading together in the library, or discussing matters of the estate over dinner. Charlotte had come to look forward to these moments more than she cared to admit, finding herself drawn to Edmund's quiet intelligence and the dry humor he revealed, only when he felt at ease. Edmund, in turn, found himself seeking out Charlotte's company more frequently than duty required, inventing small reasons to interrupt his work, simply to hear her thoughts on some matter or another. It was during one such evening, as they sat together in the library, with a fire crackling warmly in the hearth, that Charlotte first noticed Edmund watching her with an expression she could not quite identify. "Is something wrong?" she asked, glancing up from her book. Edmund seemed startled, as though caught in a private thought he had not intended to reveal. "No," he said quickly. "Nothing is wrong. I was simply thinking how much this house has changed since you arrived." Charlotte smiled softly, setting her book aside. "It has changed a great deal, hasn't it? I confess, I did not expect to feel so at home here, not so soon. Nor did I expect it," Edmund admitted. "I feared, when we married, that this house might always feel as cold and empty as it did after I returned from the war. Instead, you have brought life back into these halls." The warmth in his voice caused a flush to rise in Charlotte's cheeks. and she found herself momentarily at a loss for words. Their eyes met across the small distance between them, and for a moment, neither of them looked away. Their growing closeness had not gone unnoticed by the household staff, nor by the small circle of acquaintances who occasionally visited Pelhurst Hall. It was during one such visit, when a distant cousin of the Ashworth family came to call, that Charlotte first encountered Lord Denby, a charming and confident widower who had inherited a considerable fortune following the death of his first wife some years earlier. Lord Denby was immediately taken with Charlotte's quiet intelligence and gentle manner, and he made no effort to hide his admiration during their brief introduction. "Your Grace," he said, bowing over Charlotte's hand with practiced elegance, "I have heard much about the unusual circumstances of your marriage. Forgive my boldness, but I confess I find myself quite curious about the woman who managed to bring such warmth back to Pelhurst Hall." Charlotte, unaccustomed to such direct attention, offered a polite but cautious smile. "You are very kind, my lord, though I fear the stories you have heard are likely more interesting than the truth." "I doubt that very much," Lord Denby replied smoothly, his eyes lingering perhaps a moment longer than propriety allowed. "I hope you will permit me to call again, Your Grace. I find myself eager to know you better." Edmund, who had observed this exchange from across the room, felt an unfamiliar tightness settle in his chest as he watched Lord Denby's attentions toward his wife. He told himself it was simply concern, a natural instinct to protect Charlotte from a man known throughout society for his careless flirtations. Yet as the days passed and Lord Denby continued his visits, calling upon Charlotte with flowers and small gifts, engaging her in lengthy conversations during social gatherings, Edmund found it increasingly difficult to dismiss his own reactions as mere protective concern. "You seem troubled this evening," Charlotte observed one night, noticing Edmund's unusually quiet demeanor during dinner. "Is something weighing on your mind?" Edmund hesitated, unwilling to reveal the true source of his discomfort. "It is nothing of importance," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Edmund," Charlotte pressed gently, "we agreed to honesty between us, did we not? Please, tell me what troubles you." He set down his fork slowly, considering his words carefully before speaking. "Lord Denby has been calling upon you rather frequently of late," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "I simply wish to ensure that his attentions are welcome, and that you do not feel obligated to entertain him if you would prefer otherwise." Charlotte studied him curiously, sensing there was more beneath his words than simple concern for propriety. "His attentions are pleasant enough, though nothing more than that," she said slowly. "Does his presence trouble you, Edmund?" "Of course not," Edmund replied quickly, perhaps too quickly. "I merely wish for your comfort and happiness." Charlotte's lips curved into a small, knowing smile, though she said nothing further on the matter that evening. She had noticed, with growing curiosity, the subtle changes in Edmund's behavior whenever Lord Denby's name arose in conversation, and she found herself wondering, cautiously, what such reactions might mean. As winter deepened and the holiday season approached, Pelhurst Hall hosted a modest gathering to celebrate the season, inviting a small circle of family and close acquaintances. Lord Denby, naturally, secured an invitation through his distant family connection, and he spent much of the evening seeking out Charlotte's company, engaging her in conversation, and requesting her company for a dance. Edmund watched from across the room as Charlotte accepted Lord Denby's invitation to dance, her laughter carrying softly through the air as they moved gracefully across the floor. He told himself repeatedly that he had no right to feel the sharp discomfort twisting within his chest, that Charlotte was free to enjoy the company of others, that their marriage had never been built upon romantic expectations. Yet as the evening wore on, and Lord Denby's attentions toward Charlotte grew increasingly persistent, Edmund found himself unable to ignore the jealousy simmering beneath his carefully composed exterior. When Lord Denby requested a second dance, drawing Charlotte close as the music began, Edmund rose abruptly from his seat, startling the small group of guests seated near him. "Your Grace?" one of the guests inquired, noticing his sudden movement. "Forgive me," Edmund said, forcing composure into his voice. "I require some fresh air." He made his way quickly toward the terrace doors, stepping out into the cold winter night, grateful for the sharp chill that helped clear the confusion clouding his thoughts. He gripped the stone railing tightly, staring out at the frost-covered gardens below, forcing himself to confront the feelings he had spent weeks trying to deny. He was jealous, genuinely, deeply jealous of Lord Denby's attentions toward his own wife. And that jealousy, he realized with sudden clarity, could not be explained away as simple protective concern for a friend's sister. It ran far deeper than duty, far deeper than the promise he had made to James so many months ago. The realization struck him with startling force. Somewhere during the quiet evenings spent reading together, the shared moments of grief and gentle companionship, the careful trust that had grown between them, Edmund had fallen in love with his own wife. The thought terrified him as much as it filled him with an unexpected warmth. He had married Charlotte out of duty, promising himself and her that he expected nothing beyond a respectful arrangement. To develop genuine feelings now, feelings she had never asked for or invited, felt like a betrayal of the very promise that had brought them together in the first place. What if Charlotte did not, could not, return such feelings? What if she viewed their marriage still as nothing more than the practical arrangement it had originally been? Lost in these troubled thoughts, Edmund did not hear the terrace doors open behind him until Charlotte's soft voice broke through his contemplation. "Edmund, are you well? You left rather suddenly." He turned to find her standing there, her cheeks flushed from dancing, a look of genuine concern etched across her features. The sight of her, illuminated by the soft glow of candlelight spilling from the ballroom windows, only deepened the ache building within his chest. "I am well," he said, though his voice betrayed the turmoil he felt inside. "I simply needed a moment alone." Charlotte studied him carefully, sensing the tension radiating from him despite his attempts at composure. "You have seemed troubled all evening," she observed gently. "Please, Edmund, tell me what is truly bothering you." He hesitated, torn between the desire to speak honestly and the fear of what such honesty might reveal, and ultimately might destroy. "It is nothing you need concern yourself with," he said finally, forcing a careful distance into his voice. "You should return to the party, Charlotte. Your guests will wonder at your absence." A flicker of disappointment crossed Charlotte's face at his evasive response, though she nodded slowly, accepting his words despite the questions clearly still lingering in her mind. "Very well," she said softly. "But Edmund, whatever troubles you, please remember that you need not carry it alone. We are meant to share such burdens now, are we not?" She turned and made her way back toward the warm light of the ballroom, leaving Edmund alone once more with his troubled thoughts. He watched her go, his heart aching with everything he had left unspoken, wondering how much longer he could continue hiding the truth of his growing feelings before they inevitably came to light. In the weeks following the winter gathering, Lord Denby's visits to Pelhurst Hall grew more frequent and more deliberate in their purpose. He had convinced himself, through careful observation and the persistent rumors circulating among society, that the marriage between Edmund and Charlotte was one of convenience only, lacking any true affection between husband and wife. Believing this to be the case, he saw no reason to restrain his growing interest in Charlotte, and began courting her attention with a boldness that left little room for misunderstanding. Charlotte, though flattered by the attention in a distant sort of way, found herself increasingly uncomfortable with Lord Denby's persistence. She had grown fond of the quiet life she shared with Edmund, the comfortable evenings spent together, the gentle trust that had developed between them despite the unusual circumstances of their marriage. Lord Denby's attentions, rather than pleasing her, only served to highlight how much she valued the bond she had formed with her husband. "You seem distracted, Your Grace," Lord Denby remarked one afternoon, as he called upon Charlotte during one of Edmund's absences at a neighboring estate to discuss matters of local governance. "I hope I am not intruding upon your thoughts." "Forgive me," Charlotte replied, drawing her attention back to their conversation. "I confess my mind has been occupied with household matters of late." "Perhaps," Lord Denby suggested smoothly, "your mind would find greater peace with company that better understood your true worth. I have observed, these past weeks, a woman of remarkable intelligence and grace, deserving of far more warmth than a marriage of convenience can offer." Charlotte's expression grew carefully composed, sensing the direction of his words. "My lord," she said firmly, "I must ask that you speak no further on such matters. Whatever the circumstances of my marriage, I hold my husband in the highest regard, and I will not entertain suggestions that dishonor the respect between us." Lord Denby, though momentarily taken aback by her firm response, recovered quickly with a charming smile. "Forgive my boldness, Your Grace. I meant no disrespect. I simply find myself drawn to your company, perhaps more than propriety allows." Despite Charlotte's clear rejection of his advances, Lord Denby did not entirely abandon his pursuit, continuing his visits under the guise of family connection and social obligation. His persistence, though unwelcome, forced Charlotte to confront her own feelings more directly than she had previously allowed herself to do. She thought often of Edmund during these encounters, comparing Lord Denby's practiced charm unfavorably to her husband's quiet sincerity. Where Lord Denby offered flattery and empty compliments, Edmund offered genuine understanding, patient companionship, and a steady presence that had become, Charlotte realized with growing clarity, essential to her own happiness. The realization startled her, forcing her to acknowledge feelings she had not fully understood, until faced with the contrast Lord Denby's attentions provided. Meanwhile, Edmund's own jealousy continued to simmer beneath his composed exterior, made worse by his awareness of Lord Denby's persistent visits during his own absences from the estate. He found himself returning from his obligations earlier than necessary, inventing small excuses to remain closer to home, unable to shake the anxious tension that gripped him whenever he considered Lord Denby's presence near his wife. One evening, upon returning from a lengthy meeting regarding estate matters, Edmund arrived home to find Lord Denby's carriage still situated in the drive, despite the late hour. He entered the house with barely concealed irritation, making his way quickly toward the drawing room where he found Charlotte and Lord Denby seated together, engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation. "Edmund," Charlotte said, rising quickly from her seat, relief evident in her expression at his arrival. "You have returned earlier than expected." "So it would seem," Edmund replied, his tone carefully controlled despite the tension radiating from him. He turned his attention toward Lord Denby, who remained seated with an air of casual confidence that only deepened Edmund's irritation. "Lord Denby, I did not realize you intended such an extended visit this evening." "Forgive me, Your Grace," Lord Denby replied smoothly, though his eyes held a challenging glint. "Your charming wife and I found ourselves quite engaged in conversation. Time seemed to slip away from us." Edmund's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, though he maintained his composed exterior. "I see. However, it grows quite late, and I am certain my wife has obligations requiring her attention tomorrow morning. Perhaps it would be best to continue this conversation another time." Lord Denby, sensing the underlying tension despite Edmund's careful politeness, rose from his seat with a knowing smile. "Of course, Your Grace. I would not wish to overstay my welcome." He turned toward Charlotte, bowing respectfully. "Your Grace, thank you for such delightful company this evening." Once Lord Denby had departed, an uncomfortable silence settled over the drawing room. Charlotte studied Edmund carefully, sensing the barely restrained frustration simmering beneath his controlled exterior. "Edmund," she said finally, "you seem troubled by Lord Denby's visit. Is there something you wish to say to me?" Edmund hesitated, torn once again between honesty and the fear of revealing feelings he had not yet fully confronted himself. "I simply worry," he said carefully, "that Lord Denby's intentions toward you may not be entirely honorable. His reputation is well known throughout society." "I am quite capable of managing Lord Denby's intentions myself," Charlotte replied, a note of frustration entering her voice. "I have made clear to him that his attentions are unwelcome, yet you seem determined to treat me as though I require constant protection, rather than trusting my own judgment in such matters." "That is not my intention," Edmund said quickly, though his own frustration made his words sharper than he intended. "I simply cannot help my reaction whenever I see him near you, Charlotte. It troubles me more than I know how to explain." Charlotte studied him carefully, sensing there was far more beneath his words than simple concern for propriety. "Why does it trouble you so deeply, Edmund?" she asked softly. "Please, be honest with me. We promised each other honesty, did we not?" Edmund felt his careful composure beginning to crack under the weight of her direct question. He looked away, struggling to find the words to explain feelings he had spent weeks trying desperately to suppress. "I do not entirely understand it myself," he admitted finally, his voice quieter now. "I only know that the thought of Lord Denby, or any man, courting your affection, fills me with a discomfort I cannot easily dismiss as mere concern for your well-being." Charlotte's breath caught softly at his words, understanding beginning to dawn in her expression. "Edmund," she said carefully, "are you suggesting that your feelings toward me have grown into something more than duty?" The directness of her question left Edmund with little room to retreat into careful evasion. He met her gaze steadily, though uncertainty flickered clearly in his eyes. I do not know how to answer that without risking everything between us, he admitted. Our marriage began as an arrangement of duty and protection, nothing more. I fear that admitting to feelings beyond that arrangement might place unwelcome expectations upon you, expectations you never agreed to when you accepted my proposal. And if I told you, Charlotte said softly, taking a small step closer to him, that such an admission would not be unwelcome at all? Edmund's heart quickened at her words, though he remained cautious, uncertain if he had understood her correctly. Charlotte, I would not wish for you to say such things simply out of obligation or gratitude for the protection I have offered you. I would never say such things out of mere obligation, Charlotte replied firmly, her dark eyes meeting his with quiet sincerity. I have found myself, these past months, growing to care for you far beyond what duty alone could explain. Your patience, your kindness, the gentle way you have allowed me space to grieve, while still offering companionship when I needed it most. These things have meant more to me than I have allowed myself to fully acknowledge. A cautious hope began to stir within Edmund's chest at her words, though years of careful composure made it difficult for him to fully surrender to such vulnerability. Charlotte, he said softly, I care for you deeply. More deeply, perhaps, than I have permitted myself to admit even to my own heart, but I fear complicating what has already become such an important part of both our lives. Perhaps, Charlotte said gently, acknowledging such feelings need not complicate things, Edmund. Perhaps it might simply allow us both greater honesty, greater closeness, than we have permitted ourselves thus far. Their eyes remained locked for a long, charged moment, the air between them thick with unspoken emotion and cautious hope. Yet before either of them could take the conversation further, the sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway startled them both, and the moment shifted quickly back toward careful composure as a servant entered the room to inform them of a late arrival requiring Edmund's immediate attention. The interruption left both Edmund and Charlotte with a lingering sense of unfinished conversation, the vulnerable admissions they had shared hanging unresolved between them as the demands of daily life intruded once more upon their private moment. Yet something had undeniably shifted that evening, a quiet acknowledgement of feelings neither of them could easily dismiss or ignore any longer. In the days that followed, an unspoken awareness settled between them, subtle, yet unmistakable. Lord Denby's visits ceased entirely, whether due to Charlotte's firm rejection or Edmund's clear displeasure during their final encounter, and the household seemed to breathe more easily in his absence. Edmund and Charlotte continued their quiet evenings together, though now charged with a gentle tension neither of them fully understood how to navigate, caught between the careful boundaries of their original arrangement and the growing warmth that had begun to blossom unmistakably between them. Charlotte found herself watching Edmund more closely during these days, noticing small details she had perhaps overlooked before, the gentle way he smiled when she made an observation that amused him, the quiet attentiveness with which he listened whenever she spoke of matters close to her heart. Edmund, in turn, found himself increasingly unable to deny the depth of feeling that had grown within him, though the fear of overstepping the careful boundaries of their arrangement kept him from voicing such feelings openly once more. It was only a matter of time, both of them sensed, before circumstances would force them to confront these growing feelings directly, before the careful distance they had maintained would finally give way beneath the weight of emotions too significant to remain unspoken forever. The crisis, when it came, arrived without warning, as such things often do. Charlotte had spent a cold, damp morning visiting a tenant family on the outskirts of the Pelhurst estate, delivering supplies to a household struggling through a difficult winter. On her return journey, a sudden storm swept in from the hills, drenching her thoroughly before she could reach the shelter of the carriage. By that evening, she had developed a troubling fever, and by the following morning, her condition had worsened considerably. Edmund, informed of Charlotte's illness the moment he returned from a brief journey to London, felt his entire world narrow sharply into a single point of fear. He rushed to her chambers immediately, finding her pale and trembling beneath heavy blankets, her breathing labored and uneven. The physician, summoned urgently from the nearby village, offered little comfort, explaining that Charlotte's fever had settled deeply into her chest, and that the coming days would prove critical to her recovery. She must rest completely, the physician instructed, packing away his instruments with a grave expression. Keep her warm, and see that she takes the medicine I have prepared every few hours. Beyond that, your grace. I am afraid there is little more to be done, except wait and hope for the best." Edmund thanked the physician mechanically, his mind consumed entirely by the sight of Charlotte lying so weak and vulnerable in the bed before him. He dismissed the servants who had gathered anxiously outside her chambers, insisting on sitting with her himself through the long hours of that first difficult night. As the hours passed, Edmund found himself gripping Charlotte's hand tightly, much as he had once gripped James's hand in that distant battlefield tent so many months ago. The memory struck him with sudden, painful clarity, the fear of losing someone he loved once again threatening to overwhelm his careful composure entirely. "Please," he whispered softly, brushing a damp strand of hair from Charlotte's fevered brow. "Please, Charlotte, you must fight this. I cannot lose you too. I cannot bear it." Throughout the following days, Edmund rarely left Charlotte's bedside, attending to her needs personally, rather than relying solely on the household staff. He read to her softly during her brief moments of restless wakefulness, spoke gently of memories they had shared together, and prayed silently through the long, dark hours of each anxious night for her fever to finally break. The Dowager Duchess, arriving quickly upon hearing news of Charlotte's illness, watched her son's desperate vigil with growing understanding. She had suspected for weeks the depth of feeling that had grown between Edmund and Charlotte, but witnessing his raw, unguarded fear during this crisis confirmed entirely what she had long suspected. "You love her," the Dowager Duchess said quietly one evening, finding Edmund still seated at Charlotte's bedside, exhaustion evident in the dark shadows beneath his eyes. Edmund did not attempt to deny his mother's observation this time, too weary and frightened to maintain any pretense of careful composure. "Yes," he admitted softly, his voice rough with unshed emotion. "I love her deeply, Mother. I fear I did not fully understand how deeply, until faced with the possibility of losing her." "Then you must tell her," the Dowager Duchess said gently, resting a comforting hand upon her son's shoulder. "When she wakes, Edmund, you must not let fear or hesitation keep you silent any longer. Life is far too uncertain, far too precious, to leave such important words unspoken." On the fourth night of her illness, Charlotte's fever finally began to break, much to the relief of the entire household. Edmund remained by her side as her breathing gradually steadied, watching with cautious hope as the harsh flush of fever slowly faded from her pale features. Sometime near dawn, exhausted from days of anxious vigil, Edmund allowed himself to rest his head briefly against the edge of her bed, his hand still gently clasped around hers. When Charlotte finally stirred awake later that morning, weak but clearly improving, she found Edmund asleep beside her bed, still holding her hand, as though he could not bear to release it even in his exhausted slumber. A soft, grateful smile touched her lips at the sight, understanding immediately the depth of care reflected in his devoted presence throughout her illness. "Edmund," she whispered softly, gently squeezing his hand. He startled awake immediately, relief flooding his features the moment he realized she was truly awake and speaking coherently once more. "Charlotte," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank heaven, you gave us all quite a fright." "I am sorry to have worried you so," Charlotte said weakly, though her eyes remained warm despite her evident exhaustion. "How long have I been unwell?" 4 days, Edmund replied softly, still holding her hand tightly within his own. 4 days. I feared I might lose you entirely." The raw vulnerability evident in his voice, in the exhausted lines etched clearly across his face, revealed far more than careful words ever could have. Charlotte studied him carefully, understanding at last the true depth of feeling he had struggled so long to express openly. "Edmund," she said softly, "were you truly so frightened?" "More frightened than I have ever been," he admitted, his voice trembling slightly with the weight of unspoken emotion. "Charlotte, I could not bear the thought of losing you. These past months, you have become so essential to my happiness, so deeply woven into my heart, that the thought of a future without you fills me with a fear greater than anything I faced even during the war." Charlotte's eyes filled with gentle tears at his heartfelt words, understanding fully now the depth of love he had struggled so long to express. "Edmund," she whispered, "I believe it is time we spoke honestly, fully, of what has grown between us these past months." He nodded slowly, gathering his courage, despite his exhaustion. "You deserve complete honesty, Charlotte, and I have hidden behind careful boundaries for far too long out of fear." The truth is, I no longer know where the duty I owed to James ends, and where my own genuine love for you begins. I only know that my feelings for you have grown far beyond anything duty alone could explain. And I feel the same, Charlotte replied softly, her fingers tightening gently around his own. I feared at first that any affection I felt toward you might simply be gratitude, or a reflection of the grief we shared together over my brother's loss. But these past months have shown me clearly that what I feel for you is entirely my own, separate from James, separate from duty or obligation. I love you, Edmund, for the man you truly are. The words, so long held carefully in check by fear and uncertainty, finally spoken openly between them, filled the quiet room with a warmth neither of them had fully anticipated. Edmund lifted Charlotte's hand gently to his lips, pressing a soft, tender kiss against her fingers, his eyes shining with unshed emotion. I love you, Charlotte, he said softly, the words finally freed from the careful restraint he had maintained for so long. Truly, deeply, and completely. Yet even amid this tender, long-awaited confession, a quiet uncertainty lingered beneath the surface of their newfound honesty. Their marriage had begun under such unusual circumstances, born from duty rather than choice, and both Edmund and Charlotte found themselves wondering, cautiously, whether such an unconventional beginning could truly support the depth of genuine love they now openly acknowledged between them. Edmund, Charlotte said softly, her expression growing thoughtful despite her lingering weakness. I must ask you something important. Do you believe our love, however genuine, can truly overcome the unusual circumstances that first brought us together? I would not wish for either of us to feel trapped by obligation, even now that we have spoken so openly of our true feelings. Edmund considered her question carefully, understanding the importance of offering complete honesty in his response. I believe, he said slowly, that love, however unconventional its beginning, can grow into something entirely genuine and lasting, if both parties choose freely to nurture it. Our marriage began out of duty, yes, but what we feel now, Charlotte, is not obligation. It is a choice, freely made, to love and cherish one another fully. Charlotte smiled softly at his heartfelt words, though a flicker of thoughtful uncertainty remained evident in her tired eyes. I believe you are right, she said quietly. Yet perhaps, once I have fully recovered my strength, we might speak further of what such a choice truly means for us both, moving forward. Edmund nodded gently, understanding her need for time and careful reflection, despite the joy of their shared confession. Whatever time you require, Charlotte, I will wait patiently. We have already weathered so much together. I have faith that whatever uncertainties remain, we shall face them together, as true partners, bound not by duty alone, but by genuine love and mutual choice. As Charlotte drifted back into peaceful, healing sleep sometime later that morning, Edmund remained quietly at her bedside, his heart lighter than it had felt in many months, yet still carrying a cautious awareness of the challenges that likely remained ahead. Their love, though genuine and deeply felt, would still require careful nurturing, patient understanding, and continued honesty if it were to truly flourish beyond the unusual circumstances that had first brought them together. Watching Charlotte sleep peacefully beside him, her breathing finally steady and calm after days of frightening illness, Edmund allowed himself, for the first time since James's death, to feel genuine hope for the future. Whatever challenges still awaited them, he resolved quietly, he would face them fully, honestly, and completely devoted to the woman who had, against all expectation, become the truest love of his life. Charlotte's recovery progressed steadily over the following weeks, her strength gradually returning under Edmund's watchful and devoted care. Yet despite the joyful honesty that had finally passed between them, a quiet thoughtfulness settled over Charlotte as she regained her health, a need to understand her own heart more fully, before allowing herself to embrace completely the love Edmund had so openly confessed. She found herself returning often to James's letters, rereading the fond words her brother had written about his dearest friend, searching carefully within herself to distinguish between genuine love for Edmund and the deep gratitude she felt toward him for honoring James's final wish so faithfully. It was important to her, she realized, that whatever she felt for Edmund existed entirely on its own, separate from any lingering sense of obligation toward her brother's memory. One quiet afternoon, seated in the small garden behind Pelhurst Hall, where the first signs of early spring had begun to appear, Charlotte allowed herself to reflect deeply on the months since her marriage. She thought of Edmund's patience during her grief, his gentle understanding when she needed space, his devoted care throughout her illness, and the vulnerable honesty he had finally shared when fear of losing her had stripped away his careful composure entirely. She realized, with growing clarity, that her feelings for Edmund had grown steadily and naturally over these months, rooted not in gratitude or obligation, but in genuine admiration for the man he truly was, beyond the promise that had first brought them together. She loved his quiet strength, his thoughtful intelligence, the gentle humor he revealed only when he felt completely at ease, and the deep capacity for loyalty and love that had first drawn her brother to value his friendship so highly. Yet even as she arrived at this comforting realization, Charlotte found herself troubled by an uncertain question. Had Edmund's love for her grown as freely and naturally as her own, or did some lingering sense of duty toward James still shape his feelings, whether he fully recognized it or not? Meanwhile, Edmund faced his own quiet struggles during these weeks. His mother, though pleased by the evident happiness developing between her son and his wife, expressed subtle concerns regarding the unconventional nature of their marriage during a private conversation shortly before her departure from Pelhurst Hall. "I am glad to see you both so happy," the Dowager Duchess said carefully. "Yet I wonder, Edmund, if society's expectations might eventually place strain upon your marriage. Charlotte came to you without fortune or significant family connection. There will be those who question the legitimacy of feelings born from such an unusual arrangement." Edmund considered his mother's words carefully, understanding the practical concerns she raised, though he found himself troubled by the implication that his love for Charlotte might somehow be viewed as less genuine due to the circumstances of their marriage. "Mother," he said firmly, "I do not care what society believes regarding the origins of our marriage. What matters is the genuine love Charlotte and I have discovered together, regardless of how unconventional our beginning may have been." Yet despite his firm words to his mother, Edmund found himself privately troubled by doubts of his own in the days that followed. He worried, quietly, whether Charlotte's growing affection toward him stemmed entirely from genuine love, or whether gratitude for his protection, combined with the shared grief they had experienced together over James's loss, had simply created an illusion of deeper feeling between them. This uncertainty came to a head one evening when Edmund overheard, quite by accident, a conversation between two guests attending a small gathering hosted at a neighboring estate. The guests, unaware of Edmund's presence nearby, spoke carelessly of the unusual circumstances surrounding his marriage to Charlotte. "It is remarkable, is it not?" one guest remarked to the other. "How quickly the Duke married his fallen friend's sister. One wonders if his feelings toward her are genuine, or simply an extension of guilt and obligation toward a friend lost in battle." "Indeed," the other guest replied, "though I suppose we shall never truly know. Such arrangements rarely begin with genuine affection, whatever fondness may develop afterward." Though Edmund knew such careless gossip should not trouble him, the overheard conversation struck a nerve of doubt he had not fully confronted within himself. Later that evening, as he and Charlotte rode home together in comfortable silence, Edmund found himself unable to shake the troubling thoughts that had taken root within his mind. "You seem distracted this evening," Charlotte observed gently, noticing his unusually quiet demeanor. Edmund hesitated, uncertain whether to share the source of his troubled thoughts, before finally deciding that honesty remained essential to the trust they had worked so hard to build between them. "I overheard some careless gossip this evening," he admitted quietly, questioning whether our feelings toward one another are truly genuine, or simply born from guilt and obligation surrounding James's memory. "I confess, though I know such gossip should not trouble me, it has stirred doubts within my own heart that I had not fully considered before." Charlotte studied him thoughtfully, understanding immediately the weight of such doubts, for she had wrestled with similar questions herself in recent weeks. "I have wondered the same, Edmund," she admitted softly. "I have spent many hours these past weeks, searching my own heart, wishing to understand fully whether my feelings for you exist entirely separate from gratitude or duty toward James's memory." "And what have you concluded?" Edmund asked carefully, his heart tightening with cautious anticipation. "I have concluded," Charlotte said gently, "that my love for you has grown entirely its own, rooted in the man I have come to know through countless quiet evenings, through your patience, your kindness, your quiet strength during my illness. Whatever duty first brought us together, Edmund, What I feel for you now exists completely independent of James, or any obligation toward his memory." Edmund felt a wave of relief wash over him at her heartfelt words, though he could not entirely dismiss his own lingering uncertainty. "I believe I feel the same," he said slowly. "Yet I confess, I still wonder sometimes whether the guilt I carry, surviving the war while James did not, has shaped my feelings toward you in ways I do not fully understand." Charlotte reached across the carriage, gently taking his hand within her own. "Perhaps," she suggested softly, "we might take some time apart from each other's immediate company, however briefly, to allow ourselves the space to fully understand our own hearts, separate from any external influence or doubt. Not because I doubt what has grown between us, Edmund, but because I believe such clarity would benefit us both, allowing our love to stand fully on its own, free from any remaining uncertainty." Edmund considered her suggestion carefully, understanding the wisdom behind her words despite the reluctance he felt at the thought of any distance between them, even briefly. "Perhaps you are right," he said finally. "Though I confess, the thought of any separation, however brief, fills me with unease." "As it does me," Charlotte admitted softly. "Yet I believe, in the end, such clarity will only strengthen what we have already built together." In the days that followed, Charlotte arranged a brief visit to a distant relation, providing herself the space and solitude necessary to fully examine her own heart, separate from Edmund's immediate presence. Edmund, meanwhile, remained at Pelhurst Hall, using the quiet solitude to reflect deeply on his own feelings, revisiting James's old letters, remembering their shared history together, and searching honestly within himself for the true source of his love for Charlotte. During this brief separation, both Edmund and Charlotte found themselves surprised by the intensity of longing that grew within them, a longing that confirmed, more clearly than any careful reflection alone could have, the genuine depth of love that had grown between them. Charlotte found herself thinking constantly of Edmund's gentle smile, his quiet strength, the comfort of his presence beside her during difficult moments. Edmund, in turn, found the quiet halls of Pelhurst Hall unbearably empty without Charlotte's warmth and gentle laughter filling its rooms. By the time Charlotte returned from her brief visit, both of them had arrived independently at the same clear understanding. Whatever uncertain beginnings had first brought them together, whatever duty or obligation had originally shaped their marriage, the love they now shared existed entirely, genuinely, and completely their own, strong enough to withstand any doubt or external questioning society might raise against it. Charlotte's carriage arrived back at Pelhurst Hall on a bright, clear afternoon in early spring, the first true warmth of the season, finally breaking through the long winter chill. Edmund stood waiting at the entrance as the carriage rolled up the familiar drive, his heart quickening with each passing moment, the weeks of quiet separation having only deepened his certainty regarding the true nature of his feelings. When Charlotte stepped down from the carriage, her eyes immediately sought his, and the warmth reflected in her gaze confirmed everything Edmund had hoped to see. Without hesitation, he crossed the distance between them, taking her hands gently within his own. "Welcome home," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "It is good to be home," Charlotte replied, her smile radiant despite the fatigue of travel. "Edmund, I have missed you more than I anticipated possible." "As have I," he admitted. "Come, let us speak privately. There is much I wish to say to you." They made their way together to the quiet garden behind Pelhurst Hall, the same garden where Charlotte had once reflected so deeply on her feelings before their brief separation. Seated together on a stone bench beneath a budding cherry tree, Edmund finally gathered the courage to speak fully of the resolution he had reached during their time apart. "Charlotte," he began, his voice steady despite the vulnerability evident in his eyes, "these past weeks, without you, have shown me clearly what I already suspected, but perhaps had not fully allowed myself to accept. My love for you is entirely genuine, entirely my own, separate from any duty I once owed to James. I do not love you because I promised him I would protect you. I love you because you are remarkable, intelligent, kind, and brave, and because these months together have shown me a depth of happiness I never believed possible after losing my dearest friend." Charlotte's eyes filled with tears at his heartfelt words, though her smile remained bright despite her emotion. "Edmund," she said softly, "I have reached the very same understanding. I love you, not out of gratitude, not out of obligation toward my brother's memory, but because you are the man I choose, freely and completely, to spend my life beside." Yet even as their hearts finally aligned in complete understanding, Edmund found himself troubled by one final consideration. He rose from the bench, pacing slowly for a moment, before turning back to face Charlotte with careful seriousness. "Charlotte," he said slowly, "I must ask you something important, and I need you to answer with complete honesty. Our marriage began under circumstances neither of us fully chose. If you wished it, I would understand entirely, and I would arrange matters so that you might have complete freedom, an annulment if you desired it, allowing you to choose a future entirely your own, unburdened by the promise that first bound us together. I would not wish for you to remain in this marriage out of any lingering sense that you owe me such loyalty." Charlotte rose quickly, closing the distance between them with clear determination. "Edmund Ashworth," she said firmly, though warmth remained evident beneath her serious tone, "do you truly believe, after everything we have shared, after everything we have discovered about our own hearts these past months, that I would choose to leave you now?" "I simply wish to ensure," Edmund said carefully, "that whatever choice you make, it is entirely your own, free from any obligation, whether toward James's memory or toward the protection I once offered you." "Then hear me clearly," Charlotte said, her voice steady and sure. "I choose you, Edmund, not because of any promise made to my brother, not because of gratitude for the protection you once offered me. I choose you because I love you, completely and freely, for the man you are. Whatever began this marriage, what exists between us now is entirely our own choice, made freely, by two hearts who have found genuine happiness together." Overcome with emotion, Edmund gently cupped Charlotte's face within his hands, his eyes shining with unshed tears of joy and relief. "Then let us begin again," he said softly, "not as two strangers bound by duty, but as two people who have freely chosen to love one another completely." "Let us begin again," Charlotte agreed softly, her voice filled with quiet joy. Edmund leaned forward slowly, and Charlotte met him halfway, sharing a tender, heartfelt kiss beneath the blossoming cherry tree, sealing at last the genuine love that had grown so unexpectedly between them. When they finally parted, both of them smiled with the quiet contentment of two hearts finally at peace with the journey that had brought them together. In the months that followed, Edmund and Charlotte's marriage blossomed fully into the genuine partnership both of them had come to cherish deeply. They continued their quiet evenings together in the library, their thoughtful conversations over dinner, and their shared devotion to the tenants and staff who depended upon their careful stewardship of the Pelhurst estate. Society, which had once whispered curiously about the unusual circumstances of their sudden marriage, gradually came to recognize the genuine warmth and happiness evident between the Duke and Duchess of Pelhurst, and the careless gossip that had once troubled Edmund faded quietly into insignificance. One quiet evening, several months after their reconciliation in the garden, Edmund found Charlotte once more in the portrait gallery, standing thoughtfully before the painting of himself and James from their younger days. He came to stand quietly beside her, following her gaze toward the joyful, youthful faces captured within the frame. "I think of him still, often," Charlotte said softly, "though the grief has softened considerably these past months." "As do I," Edmund replied gently. "I believe, though, that he would be pleased to see how things have unfolded between us. He loved you dearly, Charlotte, and he trusted me completely. I do not believe he could have imagined a better outcome than the happiness we have found together." Charlotte smiled softly, reaching for Edmund's hand as they stood together before the portrait. "I believe you are right," she said quietly. "What began as a promise has become something far greater, something entirely our own. I am grateful, truly, for the path that brought us here, however unexpected it once seemed." "As am I," Edmund agreed, gently squeezing her hand. "Whatever challenges we may yet face, Charlotte, I know now that we shall face them together, bound not merely by duty or promise, but by genuine, lasting love." Together, they stood quietly before the portrait a while longer, honoring the memory of the man whose final wish had unexpectedly brought them such profound happiness, before turning together to continue their life ahead, hand in hand, hearts finally and completely united in genuine, freely chosen love. The promise James had asked of his dearest friend had been kept fully and faithfully, yet what had grown from that promise had become something far greater than either Edmund or Charlotte could have imagined on that quiet day of their unusual wedding. It had become a love entirely their own, strong enough to withstand doubt, distance, and the careful whispers of society. A love chosen freely, cherished deeply, and destined to last for the whole of their lives together. 2 years passed at Pelhurst Hall, and with them came changes neither Edmund nor Charlotte could have fully anticipated on that quiet spring evening in the garden. The estate flourished under their combined care, the tenants speaking often of how much brighter and more prosperous their lives had become, since the new Duchess had taken such a personal interest in their welfare. Charlotte had established a small school for the children of the estate workers, teaching reading and simple arithmetic herself on the afternoons she could spare, while Edmund oversaw improvements to the farmland that increased yields and eased the burden on families who had once struggled through harsh winters. Their happiness deepened further with the arrival of their first child, a daughter they named Eleanor, born on a mild autumn morning, with her mother's dark eyes, and, as Edmund often remarked with quiet pride, her uncle's easy laughter, even as an infant. Charlotte wept with joy the first time she held her daughter, thinking of James and how deeply he would have loved to know his sister had found such complete happiness, and that a new life now carried forward something of the family he had left behind. Yet even amid such contentment, new challenges arose that tested the strength of the bond Edmund and Charlotte had built together. Mr. Harold Finch, Charlotte's cousin who had once controlled her fate so carelessly, found his own fortunes declining sharply due to poor management of the Alden estate he had inherited. Facing mounting debts and the threat of losing the property entirely, Finch arrived unexpectedly at Pelhurst Hall one autumn afternoon, seeking assistance from the cousin whose life he had once treated with such indifference. Edmund received him coldly at first, remembering clearly the danger Finch had once posed to Charlotte's happiness and safety. Yet Charlotte, upon hearing of her cousin's visit, insisted on speaking with him herself, curious to understand what circumstances could have brought him to seek help from the very people he had once dismissed so readily. "You have some nerve," Edmund said quietly to Finch as they gathered in the drawing room, "arriving here to request assistance, after the manner in which you once treated your own cousin." "I understand your anger, your grace," Finch replied, his usual arrogance notably absent, replaced instead by genuine desperation. "I do not come here proudly. I come because I have nowhere else to turn, and because whatever my past failings, Charlotte remains my only living family." Charlotte studied her cousin carefully, remembering the fear and helplessness she had once felt under his careless authority. Yet she also recognized, in his current desperation, a man who had perhaps never truly understood the harm his actions had caused, blinded by his own troubles and poor decisions, rather than deliberate cruelty. "What is it you require, cousin?" Charlotte asked, her tone measured but not unkind. Finch explained his situation slowly, revealing debts accumulated through poor investments and careless management, threatening not only his own future, but the livelihoods of the tenants who depended upon the Alden estate for their survival. Though Edmund remained skeptical of Finch's sincerity, Charlotte found herself moved by concern for the tenant families who would suffer most should the estate fall into complete ruin, families she remembered fondly from her own childhood there. After careful discussion between Edmund and Charlotte that evening, they agreed to a compromise. Edmund would provide financial assistance sufficient to stabilize the estate, but only under strict conditions, requiring Finch to relinquish direct management of the property to a steward appointed jointly by Edmund and Charlotte, ensuring the tenants would never again suffer under careless or self-interested governance. Finch, humbled considerably by his circumstances, accepted the arrangement gratefully, and though he never became particularly close to Edmund or Charlotte, a cautious civility eventually developed between them, allowing old wounds to heal slowly with time. The resolution of this difficult family matter brought Charlotte a quiet sense of closure she had not realized she still needed, a final settling of the troubled circumstances that had once threatened her happiness so severely. She found herself able, at last, to think of her childhood home, without the anxious dread that had once accompanied such memories, replaced instead by gentle nostalgia for the years spent there with James, before the war had changed everything. As their daughter Eleanor grew from infancy into a curious, energetic toddler, Edmund found himself reflecting often on the unexpected turns his life had taken since that painful night in the war tent when he had made his promise to James. He had imagined, in those difficult days following his friend's death, that fulfilling his promise would bring him only a sense of dutiful obligation fulfilled. a debt repaid to a friend he could never truly compensate for his loss. He had not imagined that keeping that promise would lead him to the deepest happiness he had ever known. One evening, as he watched Charlotte gently rocking their daughter to sleep in the nursery, humming softly a tune James had once favored during their years of friendship, Edmund felt a profound gratitude settle over him. Gratitude not only for the love he had found with Charlotte, but for the friendship that had, however indirectly, made such happiness possible. "She has your smile," Charlotte observed softly, glancing up as Edmund entered the nursery, watching their daughter's peaceful, sleeping face. "And your eyes," Edmund replied gently, coming to stand beside her, wrapping his arm tenderly around her shoulders. "She is fortunate indeed, to carry pieces of both of us, and perhaps something of James as well. In that laughter you say reminds you so much of him." Charlotte smiled softly, leaning into Edmund's comforting embrace. "I believe he would be so proud, Edmund, to see the family we have built together. I believe he would consider his final wish more than fulfilled." "I believe so as well," Edmund agreed quietly. "Though I confess, I never imagined, on that terrible night when I made my promise to him, that keeping my word would bring me such complete and unexpected joy." They stood together quietly for a long moment, watching their sleeping daughter, grateful for the unlikely path that had brought them to this place of deep contentment and genuine love. Outside, the estate grounds stretched peacefully beneath a gentle evening sky, the tenants safely settled for the night, the household running smoothly under their careful, devoted management. In the years that followed, Edmund and Charlotte's marriage continued to deepen and flourish, weathering the ordinary challenges and joys that accompany any lasting partnership, yet always grounded firmly in the genuine love they had discovered together, against all expectation. Their daughter grew alongside a younger brother, born some years later, and Pelhurst Hall, once cold and empty following Edmund's return from war, became instead a home filled with warmth, laughter, and the quiet contentment of a family built on honesty, patience, and love freely chosen. Charlotte often returned, in quiet moments, to the memory of James's letters, still kept carefully in the library desk where she had first discovered them. She would read them occasionally to her children as they grew older, sharing stories of the uncle they had never known, ensuring his memory remained a living, cherished part of their family's story, rather than simply a distant tragedy from the past. And Edmund, whenever he found himself standing before the portrait gallery, gazing up at the youthful image of himself and James, felt not only the familiar ache of loss that never entirely faded, but also a deep and abiding gratitude for the unexpected gift his friend's final request had ultimately given him. A promise made in grief and desperation had grown, through patience, honesty, and genuine care, into a love that defined the whole of his remaining life, a love he would cherish completely for as long as he lived. What began as duty had become devotion. What began as obligation had become the deepest joy either of them had ever known. And though the path that brought Edmund and Charlotte together had been born from tragedy and loss, the life they built together stood, in the end, as a lasting tribute to love's remarkable ability to grow, unexpectedly and completely, from even the most difficult beginnings.